September 1st, 1939. Across Europe, the morning began in uneasy silence that would soon be broken by sirens, orders, and the rumble of engines. Radios crackled to life with urgent voices. German forces had crossed into Poland before dawn. Columns of armor pushed through misty fields while dive bombers carved black streaks across a pale sky. Civilians looked up, not yet understanding that the age of total war had returned. By midday, Britain and France declared war. The careful illusion of peace, maintained for 20 fragile years, shattered in a single news cycle. Yet this was not the true beginning. Wars rarely start in an hour. They gather like storms, pressure building across seasons, until the first bolt finally strikes. The story of 1939 is not only about armies and maps, but about what failed between wars, promises, economies, courage. What the world called peace was often only postponement. Beneath treaties and speeches, resentment smoldered, waiting for air. The invasion of Poland was the spark, not the fuel. To understand why the fuse burned so quickly, we must turn back to a conference table in 1919 and a settlement that tried to end one war by planting the seeds of another. When World War I ended, Europe sought order in the ruins. At Versailles, the victors tried to write a future that would keep the guns silent. Instead, they wrote a peace that made silence brittle. Germany was forced to accept guilt, pay vast reparations, surrender territory, and limit its army to a shadow. For some, it felt like justice after years of blood. For Germans, it felt like humiliation written into law. The new Weimar Republic inherited debts, enemies, and a wounded national pride. French troops occupied the Ruhr to enforce payments. Strikes, clashes, and bitterness followed. Across borders, new states were born with old grievances baked into their maps. The settlement stabilized the moment, but destabilized the decade. It offered rules without reconciliation, punishment without persuasion, and hope that asked the defeated to applaud their own defeat. Real peace needs legitimacy. Versailles delivered compliance. In the cafes and barracks of a battered continent, men argued about betrayal and destiny. The armistice had stopped fighting, not ended the war inside memory. Within that memory lay myths, and within myths, movements. A treaty meant to make war unthinkable made a second war imaginable, provided someone could promise to undo the shame. The early 1920s in Germany were a struggle to breathe. Hyperinflation turned wages to dust. Prices jumped between morning and night. Savings evaporated like fog at noon. Photographs showed wheelbarrows of banknotes and empty tables at home. The Dawes Plan brought temporary relief. American loans, rebuilt factories, a fragile optimism in music halls and modern streets. But prosperity sat on stilts. In 1929, the Wall Street crash kicked those stilts away. Global credit seized. German banks failed. Unemployment soared past the patience of hungry families. The currency had been rescued, yet confidence drowned. Democracy, already fragile, looked indecisive. Parliament argued while soup lines lengthened. In the public square, militants offered simpler answers: blame, order, destiny. Parties that promised certainty outshouted those that offered compromise. Conspiracy softened despair into purpose. A generation too young for the trenches but old enough to inherit anger looked for direction. In this atmosphere, radical leaders discovered the most valuable political resource of the age: fear. Fear of chaos, of the outsider, of humiliation reborn. When people conclude that nothing works, they will gamble on anyone who promises that everything will. The stage was set for a movement that could turn grievance into power. Authoritarians came bearing confidence when democracies could not. In Italy, Mussolini marched on Rome with theatrical certainty and a promise to restore pride. In Japan, militarists argued that empire would solve the island nation's constraints. In Germany, Adolf Hitler transformed wounded patriotism into a mobilizing myth. He offered enemies to blame and banners to follow. Jobs returned through rearmament. Spectacles converted doubt into fervor. Many abroad mistook the torch-lit parades for harmless theater, a catharsis for a humiliated people. But behind the staging grew a system built on fear. Censorship tightened, opponents vanished, Jews were stripped of rights, and camps multiplied. Propaganda fused grievance with destiny, teaching that compromise was weakness and that violence purified. The League of Nations scolded, yet hesitated. Each bold step, rearmament, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, met only protests, never force. Confidence bred risk. Risk bred victory. With every success, the regime convinced itself that the world lacked the will to resist. The lesson seemed clear. The last war had broken Europe's courage. If no one would stop the next move, why not make it? The march toward open conquest became a matter not of if, but when. Crisis revealed the gap between hope and action. Having absorbed Austria without a shot, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Britain and France, haunted by the memory of trenches and mustard gas, searched for a way to preserve peace without firing a bullet. In Munich they found it, or thought they did. After tense meetings, they agreed to transfer the Sudeten territories, without Czechoslovak leaders at the table. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to cheering crowds, paper raised, declaring, "Peace for our time." For millions, it felt like deliverance from another slaughter. For Hitler, it confirmed a suspicion. His opponents feared war more than he did. Appeasement was not surrender of values alone. It was a bet that concessions could satisfy a regime animated by expansion. The bet misunderstood appetite. Concessions taught the lesson that threats worked. The strategic loss was immediate. Czechoslovakia's defenses gutted and industry seized. The moral loss was larger, the signal that law could yield to intimidation. Munich did not cause the war. It made the road to war smoother, convincing a gambler that the table would always tilt his way. As Europe watched Berlin menace Warsaw, the unthinkable happened. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, enemies in doctrine, aligned in interest. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, announced as non-aggression, hid secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of control. For Hitler, the Pact removed his greatest fear, war on two fronts, opening the path to strike Poland without Soviet interference. For Stalin, it bought time to rearm, land to buffer, and leverage for later. The Pact stunned foreign capitals. Two totalitarian powers agreeing not on peace, but on partition. Maps in embassies were redrawn in pencil strokes that would soon become front lines. Diplomats scrambled for meaning. Newspapers spoke of betrayal and shock. Yet the logic was cold. Ideology yields to strategy when both sides expect to profit. The agreement did not merely rearrange borders. It dissolved illusions that ideology alone would dictate choices. In late August, freight trains moved west. Officers finalized timetables. Propaganda prepared narratives. The fuse, already lit, burned shorter. Europe's crisis had entered its final countdown, and the hour hand was now very near midnight. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, guns opened on Westerplatte, and armored columns crossed the Polish frontier. Stukas shrieked downward, rail hubs and bridges vanished in smoke. Polish forces fought with resilience, but speed and concentration favored the attacker. Civilians filled the roads, pushing carts past ditches and burning barns. Within days, towns fell in rapid succession. Warsaw endured bombardment that turned neighborhoods to ash. Then, on September 17, the second hammer fell as Soviet troops entered from the east, executing the secret Pact's design. Poland, caught between two powers, was carved apart while the world watched. Britain and France declared war, yet their armies remained behind fortified lines in the west. Headlines called it the start of a new cataclysm. Soldiers waiting in trenches called it the phony war. For Poland, there was nothing phony at all, only loss and occupation. The swift collapse did more than alter a map. It confirmed that the rules of the last peace no longer constrained the ambitions of those willing to break them. The war had begun in earnest, exactly where strategy had planned and conscience had failed. The calamity of 1939 was not a sudden storm. It was a season long foretold. Each violation answered with protest instead of power. Each warning postponed in the name of prudence. Each lie allowed to stand because the truth was inconvenient. Democracies confused patience with safety and diplomacy with denial. Leaders feared being first to move. Publics feared being first to sacrifice. Silence, multiplied across cabinets and newspapers and living rooms, became policy. It is tempting to believe that peace is simply the absence of fighting. But peace without credibility invites the very dangers it hopes to avoid. By 1939, the arithmetic was simple. The longer action was deferred, the higher the eventual price. Poland paid first, but not alone. Others would follow as the logic of conquest spread outward. This is the cost of mistaking quiet for stability. When threats succeed, they repeat. When boundaries are theoretical, they vanish. The lesson written in that first autumn of war is harsh but clear. Peace survives only when defended, and warnings ignored do not disappear. They return with interest. The fall of Poland reshaped strategy across continents. In Berlin, success validated the doctrine of speed. Concentrate, break through, encircle, conclude. In Moscow, the harvest of the Pact seemed ripe, even as the Red Army revealed weaknesses. In Paris and London, declarations of war stood awkwardly beside inaction. The winter that followed felt strange. Barracks busy, fronts quiet, factories stirring for a conflict that had not yet arrived in full. Refugees threaded Europe's roads. Neutral states balanced prudence against principle. American debates flickered between isolation and alarm. Yet beneath the apparent pause, momentum gathered. Naval battles widened. Plans formed for Norway and the Low Countries. Intelligence services multiplied risks and rumors. The term phony war masked a brutal truth. Delay did not equal safety, only staging. By spring, the offensive would leap westward, and the map would change again in weeks. What began in Poland was never meant to end there. The first act of a larger tragedy had closed. The next curtain was already rising, and the audience, willing or not, was trapped inside the theater. World War II began with movement on a border, but its cause lay in the years when borders were only words. It began with a treaty that punished more than it reconciled, with economies that collapsed faster than hope could rebuild, with leaders who mistook threats for bargaining chips, and publics that mistook quiet for peace. The invasion of Poland was the event. The origins were choices, accumulated, avoidable, and ignored. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes in familiar cadences. Grievance weaponized, courage discounted, responsibility deferred. The warning from 1939 is not merely geopolitical, it is human. When fear becomes policy and truth becomes optional, the path to catastrophe shortens. Real peace requires more than treaties and speeches. It demands credibility, memory, and the will to act before the storm arrives. The world that burned after September 1st was not surprised by fire. It had watched the smoke for years. If we forget why that smoke rose, we will one day mistake the glow on the horizon for sunrise rather than flame.